Michael Gira has repeatedly stated he took the moniker Swans as it best described the sound he wanted. Gira's summation of the name follows along the lines of swans are majestic, beautiful looking creatures with really ugly temperaments. I mean, as someone who has listened to every album from this band before, I can tell you for sure that this is a very accurate description. Speaking of swans, today is Halloween. Happy Halloween, you beautiful people watching this video. And you know, what better way to celebrate Halloween than to talk about disturbing music? I mean, that's what I did last time, and it resulted in my most viewed video by a landslide. So hey, let's do it again. I was originally going to do a disturbing albums iceberg where, yeah, as the name will imply, I will talk about 30 albums or so that I found to be generally creepy, disturbing, eerie, etc, and follow it through this iceberg format. But considering the size of the project, I feel like I didn't really have enough time to, well, go through it. So instead, I'll talk about one album in length here, Soundtracks for the Blind. Considering that this is actually one of my favorite albums of all time, I'm actually surprised that I haven't covered this album on my channel before. And let me tell you, it's definitely a very unique album. I've heard over 1,300 albums throughout my entire life, including again every Swans album. And yet Soundtracks still feels like a record that really does feel like it exists within its own sphere. Like an album that I cannot really think of anything else that's really quite like it. And if you heard the album, which I assume you did considering that you are watching a video that's essentially a retrospective of it, you could argue that those qualities that I mentioned are also part of what makes this album in particular very uncanny and eerie. As the name will imply, this album functions as a soundtrack for a non-existent film, at the very least according to Wikipedia. But you know, I don't think that really describes this album enough. Soundtracks is a lot of things. One, I think this album is in a way all of the band's evolution from 1983 with Phil to 1986 put into one album. And when I mean that, it's not just me praising the record for being, you know, a very meaty, immersive, hypnotizing experience with so much that's overwhelming you throughout, but believe it or not, there's actually also a big part of how this album was made. If you look at the background to the album, a lot of it consists of several audio collage and textural samples that were recorded in several different times. And there was a lot of material as well, which may explain part of the reason why this album in particular was very long, like over 2 hours long. Like even longer than anything else they've ever made, including the albums from the 2010s that are mostly also 2 hours long. And the history of samples, recordings, and ideas that the band spawned throughout all of these years became pretty much the foundation to this album, but not in the way one might think. So you know this genre of people using raw, unedited recordings of videos or audio clips for horror purposes, right? This is like a novelty that actually became popular in the mainstream, especially in the internet. You have things like the whole horror subgenre known as found footage, with movies like The Blair Witch Project or Paranormal Activity, or even in music with a project like Everywhere at the End of Time. That's essentially a musical interpretation of the stages of dementia using ballroom music samples. Although you probably already know that, considering how popular this album has become in the last decade or so. And when it comes to music that's centered on using several audio recordings from different periods of times with the intention of creating something a lot more eerie and unsettling, Soundtracks for the Blind is for sure part of that same boat as well. And the album lets you know that right away from the very first track. You have an ominous melody loop drawn in seas of lo-fi drone and ambient all around it, and even the song itself is called Red Velvet Corridor, which actually does sound accurate to its name. It works perfectly as a first track, especially when you pair it together with the second track, I Was a Prisoner in Your Skull. A song that just pulls off several unsettling moments out of its own back without rhyme or reason. Like the weird voice at the start of the song that just kind of comes out of nowhere, or the recording tape of the second half of the song that, well, leaves several questions up in the air. Like this whole recording is so big and has so little of it explained that it actually even ends on a cliffhanger. Yeah, you never get to know the third reason why this person in particular is apparently more fucked up than him. Soundtracks does all sorts of things like that throughout its long runtime. It's not just an album that incorporates several samples, effects, and deeper soundscapes to lure and hypnotize you deep into its music, but in general, the album just feels like its own completely distant world. And what makes it particularly stand out among a lot of the other music music that you could argue is also disturbing is that the album is generally very unpredictable. Like, it's so vague and blurry on what most of these tracks are generally conveying. The eeriness of the record is just built around its complete sense of mystery. I mean, you have a girl spouting, "Hi, it's a sunny day, a beautiful day," in the middle of this hazy, unnatural instrumental, and then following that up with a monologue of what I think it's a fun sex call. I don't know, it certainly is a complete contrast of the first part of the song. And again, it's done with no rhyme or reason, leaving it up to interpretation, like in its own little demented manner. And then you have other songs from the album like Jump Jump Killers, which is probably one of the more accurate examples that I can think of when I said that this album feels more like it's on completely Disney World. Like, very bizarre Disney World, because the song is really bizarre. But it feels like a band performing this really weird, primal sounding song with lyrics about cannibalism and the most lo-fi sounding live recordings to a crowd of people who just cheers up at the very end, like if this kind of music was actually normal to them. It's definitely a very strange song. Also, the funny part about this song is that it apparently originates from Jarbo's album Sacrificial Cake, and this is actually just the live recording. I mean, I haven't listened to the original song, but goddamn, could you imagine if the original song was actually weirder? I mean, I guess I should probably give it a listen to find out. Also, if you want to see an even more wicked and unsettling version of this song, Hypo Girl from the second disc of this album is essentially just that. My favorite songs from this album though have always been Volcano, All Line Up, and The Sound. Volcano falls into one of the categories of the album, where you contrast happy sounding, saccharine-like vocals with a very distorted, disturbing, and ominous instrumental. Question: have you seen the movie Perfect Blue? This song to me kind of feels like the musical version of that in a way. I mean, there's even an A&B about it that honestly just fits too well, almost as if the song was actually made for the movie. And the instrumental itself is also very interesting in what it does. It's not like the very drony, atmospheric instrumentals that I've talked about in the other songs. This is actually like a happy sounding electronic dance song that's completely altered into something very uncanny instead. Reverse beats, overwhelming bits of distortion here and there, strange electronic sounds throughout the track. Even the lyrics get progressively more darker and more fucked up the more the song goes on, and it's all happening while the song keeps the same sound throughout. All Line Up is probably the most disturbing song of the album to me. I mean, just the lyrics alone, where it's about a row of children being sacrificed in a ritual with very disturbing detail in many of the lines, but also the fact that the instrumental isn't even really an instrumental but a very persistent, hypnotizing wind sound with occasionally bits of melody here and there, and not to mention the sudden, chilling, grand blast of guitar noise that happened a few times in the song. Yeah, this one really is quite disturbing. And then you have The Sound, which is definitely my favorite of the album and probably my favorite Swans song in general. It's not necessarily one of the most disturbing of the record, but it encapsulates what I love about post-rock the most. The whole song doesn't just feel like an intense build-up, but it also feels like I'm being ascended into some form of realm that I never encountered before. Like, just the way that the song blends these lo-fi guitars and wall of noise and expands on them, slowly pulling you even further into its soundscape, it's just generally insane. It's definitely quite a religious experience. Yeah, generally some of the best moments of the album for me are the ones that are centered on luring you deep into its soundscapes and how hypnotizing they can really be. I've just talked about The Sound, but I think Helpless Child also does this exceptionally. It's slow, it's meditative, and it even feels downright isolating at times. But that second half definitely moves me emotionally in ways that not really many other songs do, you know. It's quite amazing. The Final Sacrifice is also another good example of this. It also has a very meditative, persistent atmosphere throughout the track, but it lingers more in suspense and even gets downright violent and angry towards the middle of the song. Out of all the tracks of the album, this one really does feel like the album's climax. Sort of a fusion of the more post-rock center elements that we've seen in songs like, again, The Sound and Helpless Child, and the more eerie and unsettling aspects of songs like All Line Up or Her Mouth Is Filled With Honey. I haven't even mentioned that that last one, but I will say that one is also pretty unsettling. And that's kind of the album generally. It isn't just an album that's built on the idea of being disturbing and frightening, but how the album approaches at it with combining these really dense walls of sounds, old recordings, drony instrumentals, drony vocals, and presenting it all with a very surreal and abnormal character. It's quite intriguing. A lot of my favorite albums of all time tend to be the ones that really don't sound like anything else that I've heard before, even the albums that might try to rip it off. And this album is definitely on that category for me. Even within the Swans discography, even though in a way it does feel like a culmination of every other album before it, at the same time it also feels very different from everything else that they've ever made, even after they came back, although you can still hear some of that soundtrack's influence in some of the later albums. There's actually one album in the band's discography that has a pretty similar album cover, and that one being The Great Annihilator. Not only a very similar album cover, but it actually came out 1 year before Soundtracks as well, and I was wondering if the album was a proto version of it, since I haven't heard it in a while. Then no, it actually isn't. Maybe the album cover style was also appropriate to do with Soundtracks as well, I don't know. By the way, you should also definitely check out The Great Annihilator. It's for sure another highlight in their discography. And yeah, the same thing goes for this album. Is it the best introduction album for Swans? Maybe not. There might be a few Swans albums that are probably more accessible than this one. Although, to be fair, all of them except for, I guess, the one time they tried to sell out to a major level have never been the most accessible to begin with. But still, this is definitely an essential. It's an essential if you're trying to get into Swans, it's an essential if you're trying to get into generally disturbing and eerie music, and heck, it's an essential for post-rock as well. It's definitely one of my absolute favorites. Happy Halloween, and I'll see you in the next Spell Spaceman.